Margaret stood frozen in the doorway of the home she had loved for 30 years, her hands trembling as her husband Richard pointed his finger toward the door and said coldly, "You have 24 hours to move out," while beside him, a woman half his age, blonde, polished, draped in designer clothes Margaret could never afford, laughed with a cruelty that echoed through the marble foyer. Entirely unaware that the deed to this house had been in Margaret's name, alone since the day her late father signed it over to her 4 decades ago. The words hung in the air like shattered glass, cutting deeper than any argument they'd ever had, and Margaret felt her knees weaken, not from fear, but from the surreal absurdity of the moment. This man, the father of her 2 children, the person she had built a life with, was now treating her like a stranger in her own home. Richard's face was stony, unreadable, as if the decades they'd shared had evaporated, and the woman beside him, who Margaret later learned was named Vanessa, slipped her arm possessively around his waist, her glossy lips curling into a smirk that said she had already won. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest, but she said nothing, not yet, because something inside her, some quiet voice she hadn't heard in years, told her to wait, to watch, to let this play out before she revealed the truth. She turned slowly, walking past the living room where her children had taken their first steps, past the kitchen where she had baked birthday cakes and nursed heartbreaks, and climbed the stairs to the bedroom she had once shared with Richard, her mind racing through memories like a film reel. Their wedding day, when he had looked at her with such tenderness, the night their daughter was born and he had cried with joy, the quiet Sunday mornings when they used to read the papers side by side in comfortable silence. But those memories now felt like they belonged to someone else, some other version of Margaret who had believed in forever. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the framed photo on the nightstand, a picture of them from 20 years ago. Smiling on a beach in Greece, and wondered when exactly he had stopped loving her. Was it gradual, she thought, or had there been a single moment when his heart turned away? Downstairs, she could hear Vanessa's laughter again, shrill and performative, followed by Richard's low murmur, and the sound made Margaret's stomach turn, not with jealousy, but with a deep, aching sadness for the life she had thought was hers. She had given up so much for this marriage, her career as an architect, her dreams of traveling the world, even her relationship with her sister, who had warned her years ago that Richard was too controlling, too dismissive of her ambitions, and now, here she was, being cast out like she was nothing. But as she sat there, something shifted inside her, a quiet ember of anger beginning to glow, and she realized that she wasn't nothing. She was the woman who had held this family together, who had worked part-time jobs to help pay for their children's education, who had nursed Richard through pneumonia and supported him through 3 career changes, and she was the woman whose name was on the deed to this house. Margaret stood, smoothed her hands over her simple cotton dress, and made a decision. She would not argue, she would not beg, she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Instead, she would let them believe they had won, just for a little while, and then she would show them who really held the power. That night, she packed a small suitcase and left quietly, checking into a modest hotel across town, where she sat by the window and allowed herself to cry for the first time, deep, wrenching sobs that came from a place of grief, not just for her marriage, but for the woman she had lost along the way. The woman who had dimmed her light to make someone else shine. The next morning Margaret woke with clarity, her tears spent, and she called her lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Diana, who had handled her father's estate years ago. And when Margaret explained the situation, how Richard had demanded she leave, how he had moved another woman into the house, how he had no idea the property was solely in her name, Diana's response was immediate and fierce. "Let me handle this." Over the next few days, Margaret stayed away, giving Richard and Vanessa just enough rope. And during that time, she did something she hadn't done in years. She reconnected with herself, visiting the art museum she used to love, sketching in a notebook she'd forgotten she owned, even meeting her estranged sister Clara for coffee, where the two women embraced and cried and talked for hours about forgiveness and second chances. Clara, who had always been the bold one, the one who had traveled and taken risks, looked at Margaret with admiration and said, "You're stronger than you know. Maggie, you always have been," and those words settled into Margaret's heart like a bomb. Meanwhile, back at the house, Richard and Vanessa were making plans, talking about redecorating, about selling Margaret's beloved garden furniture, about erasing every trace of her, and Vanessa had even started referring to the house as ours, posting photos on social media with captions about new beginnings, blissfully ignorant of the storm that was coming. On the 5th day, Diana called Margaret and said, "It's time," and together they drove to the house, pulling up in Diana's sleek black car just as Richard and Vanessa were unloading shopping bags filled with new curtains and throw pillows. Margaret stepped out of the car, her posture straight, her expression calm, and Richard's face went pale when he saw her, his confidence faltering for just a moment before he recovered and said, "I thought I told you," but Margaret held up her hand, silencing him with a gesture that was both gentle and commanding. "Richard," she said quietly, "we need to talk." Diana stepped forward, introducing herself as Margaret's attorney, and the color drained further from Richard's face as Diana calmly explained that the house, this entire property, including the land it sat on, was and had always been in Margaret's name alone, inherited from her father long before she and Richard were married, and that Richard, in fact, had no legal claim to it whatsoever. Vanessa's smile vanished, replaced by confusion, then indignation, and she turned to Richard, demanding an explanation. But Richard just stood there, speechless, the weight of his miscalculation settling over him like a heavy fog. "You have 24 hours to remove your belongings," Diana continued, her tone professional but firm, "and if you refuse, we will proceed with a formal eviction and a restraining order." The words, so similar to the ones Richard had thrown at Margaret just days before, seemed to hit him like a physical blow. And for the first time in years, Margaret saw something in his eyes that looked like shame. Vanessa, however, was furious, sputtering about rights and fairness. But Diana simply handed Richard a folder of legal documents and said, "Everything is outlined here. Suggest you read it carefully," before turning and walking back to the car, leaving Margaret standing alone with the two people who had tried to erase her. Margaret looked at Richard, really looked at him, and saw not the villain she had imagined, but a man who had grown older, more tired, more afraid than she had realized. A man who had perhaps been chasing youth and excitement because he couldn't face his own mortality, his own failures. She felt a flicker of pity, but also a deep, unshakable certainty that she deserved more than this, that she deserved a life where she wasn't diminished or dismissed. "I loved you, Richard," she said softly, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened to fall. "I loved you with everything I had, and I would have stood by you through anything, but you didn't just break my heart. You forgot who I was, and worse, you made me forget too." Richard opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came, and Vanessa, sensing the shift, grabbed his arm and tried to pull him toward the door, but he didn't move. His eyes locked on Margaret's. "I'm sorry," he finally whispered, and though the words were small, Margaret could hear the genuine regret in them, the realization of what he had lost, and she nodded, not in forgiveness, not yet, but in acknowledgement. "You have until tomorrow," she repeated, then turned and walked back to Diana's car, her head held high, and as they drove away, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, freedom. Over the following weeks, Richard moved out, taking only what was his. And Vanessa, unsurprisingly, disappeared from his life the moment she realized there was no mansion, no easy life waiting for her, and Richard found himself alone in a small apartment, facing the consequences of his choices. Margaret, meanwhile, began to rebuild. Not just the house which, She redecorated with bright colors and personal touches that reflected her own taste, not his but herself, enrolling in an online architecture course, volunteering at a community center, and slowly, carefully, opening her heart to the possibility of joy again. Her children, when they learned what had happened, were devastated by their father's actions, but proud of their mother's strength, and they rallied around her, filling the house with laughter and love during weekend visits. One afternoon, several months later, Margaret was in her garden, planting roses, when she heard a knock at the gate, and there stood Richard, looking older, humbled, holding a single letter in his hands. "I'm not here to ask for anything," he said quietly. "I just wanted to give you this, and to tell you that I'm in therapy, trying to understand why I did what I did, and I know I can never undo the hurt, but I needed you to know that you deserved better. You always did." Margaret took the letter, her hands steady, and she looked at the man she had once promised forever to, and she realized that she didn't hate him. She had moved beyond that, into a space where she could acknowledge the good years they'd had, while also accepting that they were over. "Thank you," she said simply. "I hope you find peace, Richard, I really do." He nodded, his eyes glassy with unshed tears, and then he turned and walked away, and Margaret watched him go, feeling not sadness, but a gentle closure, a final letting go. She never opened the letter she didn't need to. Instead, she placed it in a box with old photos and mementos, things that belonged to her past but not her future, and she went back to her garden, her hands in the soil, the sun warm on her face, and she smiled, a real, genuine smile that came from deep within, because she had reclaimed not just her house, but herself. In the end, Margaret understood that the house had never been just about walls and rooms. It had been about what she built inside it, her resilience, her dignity, her capacity to rise, even when everything seemed lost. And she knew now that no one could ever take that from her again, because the strongest foundations aren't made of brick and mortar. They're made of the courage to stand tall when the world tries to make you small, the grace to forgive without forgetting, and the wisdom to know that your worth is not determined by who stays or who leaves, but by the unwavering truth of who you are when you stand alone. And as Margaret looked at her home, her sanctuary, she whispered to herself a promise: "I will never make myself smaller again." And in that moment, she was finally, completely, beautifully free.